The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Going back to those tectonic plates that we were referring to, I'm sure everyone is saying, okay, well, how does this play out? I get how we got here.
Yeah.
I understand what Jeff is saying. I get it about deflation and productivity and the Fed and the government having to create all these extra dollars or currency units of fiat currency to try to battle it. But where do we go? I mean, do we go into this deflationary spiral where, and then if we do, does that mean asset prices or does that mean consumer prices? Does that mean the dollar gets stronger, or do we go into inflation? And if so, how do we, move around those different compartments of asset prices, consumer prices, and the dollar against other fiat currencies? And then maybe like short-term, mid-term, long-term.
Okay. So for me, again, coming back to the principle, I'm talking about a long-term cycle
Right.
that is unstoppable. And what I'm talking about is what I want for my children to grow up in, a future that I want them to grow up in, and that's why I wrote the book. Now, in something that's falling down like this, and has to be manipulated, and so if there's misinformation money, there's misinformation everywhere else. So most people are consuming the world through that misinformation.
Right.
And that is bound to get worse. So and when I say worse, let's use first. I'm Powell and everything else, and I signal to the world that I'm going to stop printing. Deflationary depression, right? And I have to, if I let it go on for too long, if I let the natural force of the market go on for too long, it just keeps on unwinding. And I have to go in and bail out all my banks. So
do you think consumer prices goes down as well, or just asset prices?
Everything.
Okay.
Everything. Over time, they just keep on falling, and essentially the counterparty risk of all the entire bond market and everything else just keeps on failing. Mm-hmm. Every bank is built on top of that. Every institution is built up of that. Our way of life is built on top of that. So do I expect that to happen? And by the way, it doesn't matter if it happens in the US or Euro or Japan or everything else. That's what they're fighting against. And so you can expect some head fakes. Oh, we're going to tighten, quantitative tightening. And then you could expect the market to react violently.
Right.
You're talking short, medium term, violently, and then come in with more easing. But the die is set. There's nothing that the existing system can do to stop what we're talking about. In 2019, if you taxed 100% of all the profits of all U.S. companies, it's $2.25 trillion.
Right.
There's nothing in taxes you can do. There's nothing. You have a structural problem that cannot be solved. Period. So expect more printing, expect more everything else, and that path. Now, what is the consequence of that? So the consequence is likely not hyperinflation, because every other government is doing the same thing. And so every other government is doing the same
in fiat currency. But do you think maybe in consumer goods and services?
Potentially.
Right.
But at the same time, free market is moving faster and faster the other way on technology rails, right? And we're all making rational choices on those technology rails. So we're concentrating power in the monopolies of technology companies at the same time, and we're making that happen faster and as a result. So what that means is, let's use housing or real estate as an example. The government pushes up real estate prices as a byproduct of their printing. Rents go up as a result. A whole bunch of people that cannot pay their food or housing or anything else expenses anymore go back to the same government that created it, whether it's Republicans, Democrats, doesn't matter. This is an apolitical conversation. It's a structural say, solve my problem, right, and give me more money. And where does that money come from? It comes from picking your other pocket and making it worse and expanding government as a byproduct. So that leads along that entire path. It leads in centralization, a completely state-run control. Mm-hmm. And along that axis somewhere, a lot of times there's revolution, war on the way there. And then when I'll get into that in a second, but it has to lead into complete state control.
Why is that, Jeff? Just to make sure we're connecting the dots there for the viewer.
because you've pushed prices up and more of the population doesn't have things.
Right.
And so they turn to socialism. They think the problem is capitalism. The problem is actually crony capitalism. And the problem. So they think the problem is a free market, and the problem is exactly the opposite of a free market. The problem is caused by government distorting a free market, but that's not what most people will hear. And again, if you actually understand most people, if you're living in some, or you talked about the McDonald's worker, if you're living something and you can't pay your bills and prices just went up, or your medical expenses or something like that, you'll listen to anybody who says that those people created it. I'll give you more money.
Yeah. And it's interesting that the solution is more money, not the solution is never more goods and services.
Exactly.
Like it should be.
Exactly. And so the die is already cast all around the world on this centralization, state control, and it'll accelerate, unfortunately.
Which means more social unrest.
And more people will turn to the same government to be able to do that. Because let's do a thought experiment today on what you talk about a lot on a lot of your different whiteboards and everything else. And let's say that governments face this truth because it's a fact. Everything I'm saying today is true. And face this truth and says, okay, we're going to stop. The entire system collapses.
Right.
And in that chaos, it's reborn, but no government will do that. So system change, like the system change that we're going through, requires, just like a business never does what they need to do to stop what's coming. Blockbuster adds candy aisles to their store instead of seeing Netflix provides differentiated economic value that I can't compete with out of my store. Kodak, who invented the digital camera, doesn't capitalize on any of the abundance that comes from the digital camera because it destroys their business. And so change is always forced onto a system from the outside. And there probably is too much kind of in Bitcoin when some of the toxicity and everything else that ends up happening in Bitcoin. But if you actually just a hope for a better future and everything else, that's the change that actually Bitcoin is driving. That's actually why I'm in Bitcoin,
right?
Because I think it's actually I think it's it's probably the only. I've looked everywhere you can imagine, every different type of system reset, how you could do this, how you could transition systems. I've done a lot of work on this path, and I've come to the conclusion that it's only Bitcoin that could provide a path to, and it's going to be messy no matter what,
right?
But a path to where we're going in a technology-driven society.
How does the Bitcoin network compete with the dollar network, which, as you know, is 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times bigger than the Bitcoin network? In my mind, I always see it as the dollar has to fail in order for Bitcoin to win, because if the dollar just stayed as it is right now, then it would be very tough for that Bitcoin network to take it over.
So let's talk about a couple of, like, instead of just binary, right? A couple of what is going to happen. So on the centralization path, you're going to have more of this kind of misinformation, more printing, because it's structural. It has to be required.
Right. Yep.
And then more people are going to understand Bitcoin because of that. So the more these two systems diverge, more people are going to move to the other system. Now, at some point, you're going to have governments having like requirement to do central bank digital currencies,
right?
Because it's the only possible path that they could actually control you more.
And control the rate of inflation.
Exactly. And control, or pick the pocket of some people and pass it to others more.
Yeah, right.
So you're actually moving into really dystopian state control and think about state control in the past versus what we're moving into with artificial intelligence and robotics. It'll look very different.
Right.
Very different. Right. So, but that's a requirement. On the path through there, you might get governments combining together and saying, okay, we're going to put Bitcoin as one of the basket of goods, one of the basket of currencies, and we're going to peg to that. Might.
Like a Bretton Woods.
Right, well, like a Bretton Woods. I don't believe they'll be able to do that fast enough, because the cooperation that would be required to be able to do that would be too hard. But you might get something like that. You might get a whole bunch of governments trying to get back on gold to be able to try to create the chaos, stop the chaos. But the cooperation needed to try to turn an inflationary environment to a deflationary one it would be almost it's almost impossible to do from the existing system. I'd say it's impossible to do from the existing system.
Right.
And so what's happening is Bitcoin, as more and more people are starting to understand this, the network effect is one of the things. But because it's a network effect at the protocol level, so it's TCP/IP, right? It's like investing in Bitcoin is like being able to be an investor in the internet itself. The second layer on top of that, Lightning and all of the other things that are happening on top of that, is where a lot of the other action happens, like the Amazons that were built on top of the Google, that were built on top of the primary protocol level. So that's what Bitcoin is. And you have a network effect. Essentially, the free market has come to for money. And you have a network effect happening on Bitcoin, and a network effect happening on a level above that, the second layer. So where a whole bunch of innovation is happening. It's still really early. It's still really early. But but what I would look at is in 1995 and 1997 and 1999, most of what people experience as the internet today didn't exist. Right? So the internet as we know it was 1989. But in 1997, it took 2 weeks to download a cat video.
Right.
Right. And so people mistake what's coming on this network effect and the innovation and the rate of innovation and what's happening. We have a bias. We have a natural bias for short term. We have a bias for what's happening right now. And we project that trend forward.
Yeah, or that recency bias, right?
That recency bias, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so the dollar network is going to lose because it has to fail because of the government's need to continue doing what they're doing. Dare I say, at an exponential rate. You know, we were talking about technology going up exponentially, therefore the money printing and the Orwellian central planning has to go up at a exponential rate as well, which drives people towards an alternative. And the best alternative out there being Bitcoin, especially when you consider the base layer and the secondary layer, the network effects of those, and it being 10x superior to the system that we have now. Is that?
Yeah, and then let's talk about altcoins for a second on that too.
Okay.
So when I talk about 10x, kind of what creates a chance for a competitor to emerge if they don't have a 10x advantage over an existing market, they almost have no chance, because to be seen, you need to have a crazy value to people to be able to overcome the marketing monopoly. That doesn't guarantee success, but it gives a much higher probability of success. But typically what 10x is in a really tiny part of a sub-market. It's not in everything. So if you looked at the overall market of the US currency and all the regions and everything that's built on top of it, that's a giant market. And Bitcoin at the start, you could say, competed against gold, right, as a store of value. What's happening on top of that is, so that's the start of the market and as a store of value, but more and more people doing, then it expands. Like you could use the same thing. Amazon was only in books.
Yeah, right.
And one in books first. Tesla only in the Roadster before they went into everything else. And so now if you take that into altcoins, what all the other altcoins are trying to do is trying to be 10x better in something else, because they're certainly not better as a store of value or monetary. And and Bitcoin is already, I would say, the king of that place. It's really early. And if there was another coin that allowed a deflationary force, right? If there was something else that was close, I think Bitcoin emerged in a part that in a spot where regulators misunderstood what it was, what it could be. And they would never make that mistake again on something else. They would try to control that network. So Bitcoin emerged, and now it's being used, and the innovation that's happening on top of it is a whole bunch of where those altcoins are playing happens on top of Bitcoin as monetary network. Is what I think happens. Not that, I'm not going to say that people can't make money in some of the altcoins, but to me, it's speculation. It's buying an exploration mining company, and doing that. Whereas Bitcoin to me is not speculation at all.